By the 3rd September, Naomi Ferris had stopped believing in bad luck. 3 years. 3 different parts of her farm had failed. First, it was the corn. Then the apple trees. Then the pasture. 3 completely different crops, in 3 completely different years, failing for 3 completely different reasons. At least, that's what Naomi had told herself. The first year, she blamed the seed. The second year, she blamed the age of the orchard. By the 3rd year, she had run out of explanations. Because this time, the grass was dying in patches while the rest of the pasture stayed green. The same strange pattern she'd seen before. Healthy ground on one side. Struggling ground on the other. And nothing on the surface that explained why. So that September afternoon, Naomi walked into the field with a soil auger and started digging. Down through the dark topsoil. Deeper. And deeper. Then, about 18 inches down. The auger stopped. She pulled it back out. Packed tight and slick between her fingers was a dense layer of gray-orange clay. A buried layer of soil that had been sitting underneath her farm all along. Naomi stared at it. And for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't looking at another failure. She was looking at an answer. Because suddenly, 3 things that had never seemed connected began to look very different. The corn hadn't simply failed. The apple trees hadn't simply grown old. And the pasture hadn't simply stopped producing. They had all been running into the same hidden problem. 1 layer of ground. 1 buried ceiling. 1 problem affecting 3 completely different root systems in 3 completely different parts of the farm. But Naomi didn't know that when the first field failed. She didn't know it when the orchard began losing its leaves. And she certainly didn't know it when the pasture followed. For 3 years, she had treated every failure as its own mystery. What exactly was happening 18 inches beneath her feet? And could she actually do anything about it? The spring, Naomi still believed she was looking at nothing more than 1 bad season. It's why the failures keep happening in places that seem to have nothing to do with one another. And sometimes, the answer has been sitting beneath your feet the entire time. To understand why a strip of dense clay buried under 3 different fields could undo 3 completely different crops in 3 completely different years, you have to go back to the spring everything first went wrong. The spring she still thought it was just 1 bad field, 1 bad season, nothing more. The first year it was the North 40, a stretch of bottomland corn Naomi had planted the same way her father always had, same seed, same fertilizer program, same timing down to the week. Half the field came up thin and pale, stunted at knee height while the rest of the field pushed on toward a normal season, and by August she'd walked those uneven rows enough times to know it in her sleep. Good corn on one side of an invisible line, struggling corn on the other, with nothing on the surface to explain where that line had been drawn. She did what anyone would have done. She blamed the seed lot, switched suppliers the following spring, and told herself a bad batch had cost her a season she'd otherwise have had no trouble with. It was a reasonable answer, and it was wrong, though she had no way yet of knowing that. A single bad year on 1 field doesn't ask to be investigated the way a pattern does. It asks to be forgiven and forgotten, and that's exactly what Naomi did with it, right up until the ground gave her a second reason not to. The second year had nothing to do with corn at all. It was the little orchard block on the east side of the property, a dozen apple trees her father had put in decades before mostly for the family's own use, that started dropping leaves early and yellowing through July in a summer that wasn't even particularly dry. She had the extension office out to look at it, half expecting some kind of blight or borer, and they found neither. The trees tested clean for disease, clean for the usual pests. Healthy enough on paper that nobody could tell her with any confidence why a third of them were struggling to hold their leaves. What nobody thought to connect that summer was the cornfield from the year before, a good half-mile away on the other side of the farm, because there was no obvious reason 2 such different pieces of ground, growing 2 such different things, should share a single cause. Naomi didn't connect them either. She top-dressed the orchard with extra fertilizer that fall, watched a few of the weakest trees recover partway, and chalked the rest up to an old orchard simply aging out, the way old orchards sometimes do. That's the trouble with a pattern spread out across years and acres instead of concentrated in one place at one time. It doesn't look like a pattern from inside any single season. It looks like two separate disappointments that happen to have landed on the same farm, and most people reasonably stop looking any harder than that. The third failure showed up in a pasture Naomi had never once worried about. A stretch of grazing ground on the southwest corner of the property that had reliably fed her small cattle herd every summer for as long as she'd owned it. That spring the forage came in thin and short across roughly a third of it, no matter how much rain fell, while the rest of the same pasture greened up the way it always had, and by June she was hauling supplemental hay to cattle standing in a field that, from the road, still looked like it should have been feeding them just fine. 3 years. 3 failures, 3 parts of the farm that had nothing obvious in common. A cornfield, an orchard, a pasture, growing 3 different things for 3 different purposes, struggling in 3 different growing seasons for reasons nobody had managed to pin down. It would have been easy and understandable to keep treating each one as its own small mystery. What changed that summer was that Naomi finally sat down with a county plat map and marked all 3 trouble spots on it side by side. Something nobody, including her, had thought to do while each problem was still happening in isolation. The 3 circles she drew that night didn't sit in a neat line, and they didn't share a crop, an owner's decision, or a season. What they shared, once she looked at the map long enough, was elevation. All 3 sat in the lower, flatter stretches of ground scattered across the farm, the exact kind of spots that seemed, on the surface, like they ought to be the best ground she had rather than the worst. Harold Dietz had spent most of his career with the county's Soil Conservation Service walking exactly this kind of ground before he'd retired the year before. And Naomi tracked him down more out of desperation than any real expectation he'd find something 3 professional visits hadn't. He didn't bring a single new test with him. He brought a soil auger, a notebook, and a question nobody else had asked her. Not what was wrong with each field individually, but whether she'd ever dug straight down through all 3. They started at the cornfield first, twisting the auger down through topsoil that gave way easily for the first foot, and then, right around 18 inches, into something that stopped giving way at all, a dense, slick, gray-orange layer of clay packed so tight the auger fought them for every additional inch. Harold didn't seem surprised. He told her this part of Missouri sat over what soil scientists call claypan ground, a natural subsoil layer common across a wide stretch of the state, formed over thousands of years as clay minerals settled and compacted into something closer to weak stone than ordinary soil. And it didn't sit evenly across a farm. It rose and fell in depth the way any buried layer does, closer to the surface in some spots than others. They walked to the orchard next, and the auger hit the same resistance at nearly the same depth. They walked to the pasture after that, and it happened a third time, close enough in depth across all 3 sites that Harold circled it in his notebook without needing to say much more about it. What that shallow clay layer did to 3 completely different kinds of ground came down to the same handful of inches, working against 3 different plants in 3 different ways. Corn roots hitting that pan early couldn't push down far enough to reach moisture once the topsoil dried out, so a normal dry spell hit those seedlings like a serious drought while the rest of the field, rooted in deeper ground, barely noticed. Apple trees, needing a much deeper root system to stay healthy over years rather than one season, had spent decades slowly running out of room to grow into, showing the strain only gradually as their root systems hit a ceiling they couldn't push through. The pasture told the same story from a different angle. Grass roots stopped short of the moisture reserve deeper soil usually holds onto, so the thinnest ground turned patchy and dry exactly when the rest of the field, rooted past the pan, kept right on growing. 3 failures that had looked like 3 unrelated problems turned out to be one shallow layer of clay, sitting at slightly different depths across the farm, doing the same restrictive work on 3 different root systems in 3 different seasons. Nothing about the corn, the apples, or the grass had actually been the problem. The ceiling under all 3 had been. If you've ever chased down 3 separate problems on your own place before realizing they traced back to one root cause, we'd like to hear how you found it. Drop it in the comments. Now, back to the Ferris farm, And what came after Naomi finally had her answer? Knowing what sat under her ground didn't hand Naomi a simple fix, because claypan doesn't go away. It's part of the land itself, not a problem introduced by anything she or her father had ever done wrong. What it gave her instead was a different set of questions to work from. That fall she brought in a subsoiler, an implement built to run a narrow shank deep into the ground and physically fracture a compacted layer without turning the whole field over, running it through the worst stretch of the cornfield to open cracks a root could actually follow down past the pan instead of stopping dead against it. In the orchard, where a single pass of heavy equipment wasn't an option among established trees, she and Harold settled on something slower, deep-rooted cover crops planted between the rows. Chosen specifically for root systems aggressive enough to work their own cracks into compacted ground over several seasons, doing gradually and biologically what the subsoiler had done to the cornfield in an afternoon. The pasture got a similar patient treatment, overseeded with a deeper rooting forage mix better suited to ground that wasn't going to offer up much more depth than it already had. None of it undid 3 years of losses, and none of it promised a single dramatic turnaround the following spring. What it did was finally point 3 separate efforts at the same actual cause, instead of 3 separate guesses at 3 separate symptoms, which was more than any of the previous 3 years had managed. It took 2 more seasons before Naomi could stand at the edge of that same North 40 and see corn standing even and full from one end of the field to the other. No invisible line splitting good ground from struggling ground. No easy way to tell from the road that anything had ever been wrong there at all. The orchard came back slower, the way old trees do, but the leaf drop stopped, and the pasture held its green further into a dry August than it had in the 3 years before Harold ever showed up with his auger. What carried Naomi through those 3 losing years wasn't a single insight arriving all at once. It was 3 years of refusing to let each failure close itself off as its own small, separate disappointment, and one evening with a plat map and a pencil that finally let her see what had been sitting the same 18 inches under her feet the whole time. The corn hadn't failed. The apples hadn't failed. The pasture hadn't failed. One layer of ground, older than any of it, had simply been asking a question none of them had thought to ask all at once. Naomi still keeps that plat map. 3 pencil circles and all, tacked up in the barn where she can see it. She says it reminds her that the hardest problems on a farm aren't always the loud ones. Sometimes they're the quiet ones, spread out just far enough apart that nobody thinks to draw the line between them until they finally sit down and look. If a story like this one is the kind of thing that stays with you, subscribe and follow The Roots. We bring you a new one every week. And if you've ever traced your own scattered troubles back to one shared cause, we'd love to hear it in the comments.